Hey guys, tonight we're slipping quietly into the narrow lanes of a medieval city, a place where the paving stones are uneven and every window spills a bit of gossip. You imagine the smell first. Smoke from damp firewood, animal dung trampled underfoot, and the sour tang of ale spilled in last night's brawl. Ahead stands the infamous quarter, where brothels are both licensed and frowned upon. They are tolerated because officials collected fees, yet shamed as sinful. You probably won't survive this night the way you expect. Comfort and glamour don't live here, only survival and a touch of dread. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know your location and local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where and when people are listening. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The brothel gates loom in front of you, less like a welcoming doorway, and more like a stubborn wooden mouth, swollen with hinges that creak in protest. Tallow candles sputter in iron sconces, throwing more smoke than light. Their glow clings to the plaster walls, cracked and painted in colors that once pretended to be cheerful, but now just look tired. A guard slouches nearby, half dozing, though his hand never strays far from a cudgel. You feel his eyes drag over you, weighing purse and purpose alike. The street behind you is restless, filled with stray dogs sniffing at piles of refuse. Somewhere, a church bell strikes the hour. The irony isn't lost on you, that pious sound reminding everyone of sin, even as city law permits this business. In fact, most towns in late medieval Europe licensed such houses, claiming it kept respectable women safe. Whether that logic worked is still debated by historians. Some argue the rules merely pushed problems further underground, while others insist it was a grim but functional compromise. You hesitate at the threshold, noting how the doorway's lintel is rubbed smooth by countless heads and shoulders. It's strange to think that this ordinary timber holds centuries of whispers and transactions, a fringe detail that often surprises people. In a few regions, brothels were painted bright red or decorated with animal symbols, so even the illiterate could find them. The doorway before you, however, shows only a faded emblem that might once have been a painted swan, its wings long since dissolved into shadow. The air grows thicker as you linger, the mix of smoke, ale, and sweat already clinging to your cloak. A burst of laughter echoes from within, but it's hollow, like a cough dressed up in costume. The legends may promise wild revels, but what you sense instead is fatigue. Tired voices, tired faces, tired hopes. You take a step closer, the wood groaning under your touch, and in that moment you realize entering is easy. Leaving before dawn, unscathed in body or spirit, may be the real challenge. The door yields with a reluctant groan, and you step into the brothel's interior, a space that strikes you not with warmth or welcome, but with the heavy sensation of a tavern where the ale has long since gone sour. The hall is crowded, though the crowd is not the kind you'd expect from ribald stories or romanticized films. The air is dim and restless, carrying the sense of tallow candles sputtering in iron holders, stale beer soaking into rough planks, and a hint of sweat that lingers like a stubborn guest. Your boots scuff across rushes spread on the floor, meant to soak up spills, though they smell faintly of mold. The walls are close and uneven, lean and angular as if the whole building has grown tired of holding itself upright. Candles flicker, but they seem more interested in producing smoke than illumination. so most of the faces around you remain half-shadowed. And perhaps that's the point. Dimness hides imperfections, whether in the paint on the wall, the pockmarks on the floor, or the hopes on the patrons' faces. A hum of conversation swirls around you, punctuated by bursts of laughter too loud to be sincere. The sound is not a roar of revelry, but rather the strained chatter of people pretending they are enjoying themselves. You notice merchants with cloaks still damp from the weather outside, apprentices with ink stains on their hands, and travelers whose boots are worn down to the stitching. All of them sit hunched over mugs of weak ale, their eyes darting, not wanting to meet each other's gaze too long, as though prolonged eye contact might acknowledge the shared awkwardness. Somewhere in the corner, a fiddler scratches out a tune that stumbles along without much conviction. His strings squeak, and a woman sitting near him claps half-heartedly in rhythm, though she is clearly more focused on staying awake than encouraging him. The music falters, and you can almost sense the entire room exhale in relief. Medieval tavern songs might be bawdy in surviving manuscripts, but here they are weary, as if the energy required to be scandalous has already been spent. Historians still argue whether brothels like this were more a form of necessary evil tolerated by city councils, or whether they truly thrived as centers of entertainment. Documents record them as heavily regulated, taxed, and patrolled. But when you stand in this dim room, they feel more like places of containment than celebration. The city collects its dues, the moralists wag their fingers, and the inhabitants, workers and patrons alike, carry on in the murk between hypocrisy and habit. You catch sight of the hearth along the far wall, but it offers no roaring blaze, only a cluster of embers that glow faintly, like eyes half shut in sleep. Smoke drifts lazily upward, escaping through gaps in the chimney, with the confidence of a cat that knows it cannot be caught. The meager warmth does little to chase away the damp chill clinging to your cloak. You pull it tighter, hoping that the gesture might convince your body to believe in a comfort that does not exist. A woman passes by you, balancing a tray with mugs of ale that slosh dangerously close to the rims. She gives you a glance, a flicker of interest perhaps, but it's more a calculation than an invitation. Her movements are practiced, efficient, as though she has learned to minimize the risk of spillage after years of carrying drinks through weaving crowds. You notice her sleeves are rolled up, revealing arms marked not with scars, but with the raw redness of endless scrubbing and lifting. The glamour people imagine does not live in her, but something steadier does. Survival. And that is the undercurrent everywhere you look. Survival, dressed up in candlelight and painted smiles. You hear a man muttering about losing his last coin in dice, and another one coughing violently into his sleeve. The cough echoes, catching attention for a moment, before being absorbed back into the ambient noise. People notice, then pretend not to, because acknowledging sickness in such close quarters would make everyone uneasy. A quirky little detail lingers in your mind. Some medieval records note that candles in brothels were deliberately kept cheap and smoky, so clients could not clearly see the conditions or the faces of those around them. Whether or not that was intentional policy, the dim light here makes it difficult to distinguish expressions. Faces blur, details soften, and only the sound of voices offers a clue to who is tired, who is angry, and who is simply waiting. You lean against a beam, feeling the wood rough under your palm. Splinters rising like little teeth. The surface is sticky with spilled ale, dried and tacky. Above you, the rafters groan as someone shifts in an upper chamber. Dust falls in a delicate trickle, reminding you that even the building itself is weary. You think of how many nights, how many arguments, how many whispered promises these beams have overheard. The structure stands like a reluctant witness, sagging but unbroken. The fiddler tries again, scraping out another tune. This time, a patron near the hearth pounds his mug on the table in rhythm, creating more racket than music. The rhythm falters almost immediately when his ale sloshes over and soaks his sleeve. He curses softly, but then laughs, as if the spillage is more entertaining than the song. You smile faintly too, because in this dim room, laughter over clumsiness feels more genuine than anything else so far. You wander a few steps farther, noticing how the benches are scarred by knives, initials carved into the wood. Some of the names are faded beyond recognition, eaten away by time and the scratching of countless replacements. Others are fresher, sharp-edged letters declaring that someone, for a fleeting moment, wanted to leave a mark in a place where permanence is otherwise scarce. A debate flickers in your head. One historians still circle around. Were brothels truly tolerated because they provided a controlled outlet for male desire? Or were they simply another taxable commodity for city officials? Both explanations exist in the records, sometimes side by side, sometimes contradicting each other. When you stand here, though, with smoke stinging your eyes and laughter echoing hollowly, the answer feels less like grand theory and more like resigned pragmatism. The brothel is tolerated because it exists, and because removing it would require a conviction few leaders actually possessed. As you let your gaze wander, you notice a small detail, a tiny shelf near the wall, holding a crude wooden figurine. It looks like a saint, though its features are so eroded you can't be sure. The idea that someone thought to place a holy figure here in the middle of a brothel's hall borders on absurd. Yet it reminds you how medieval people rarely separated sacred and profane spaces as neatly as modern sensibilities might. People prayed in fields, in taverns, even in brothels. Faith and sin sat side by side, each pretending not to notice the other. The hall grows warmer as more bodies crowd in, though the warmth is the kind that feels stifling rather than comforting. You wipe your brow, noting that even in a place meant for escape, there is no relief. The room is thick with contradictions, laughter and silence, fatigue and persistence, regulation and rebellion. You realize this is the first impression, the welcome mat of medieval vice, not the riotous indulgence of folklore, but a strained and weary gathering where people seek distraction but find only dim echoes of it. And already, as you breathe in the mingled scents and hear the hollow laughter, you wonder if you will last until dawn. The brothel mistress notices you before you notice her. She stands just beyond the smoky haze of the main hall, framed in the doorway of a smaller chamber, one hand on her hip, the other resting on the edge of the doorframe, as if it belongs to her, more than to the building itself. Her gaze fixes on you, sharp and unyielding, and you feel suddenly like a sack of grain being weighed at the market. Every detail of your stance, your clothes, and most importantly, the bulge of your purse is measured in a single, sweeping look. She is not dressed like the women drifting between tables. Instead of low-cut bodices or silken sleeves, she wears sturdy wool dyed a dark color that hides stains and age. Her hair is covered with a linen coif, not unlike a housewife's, though you suspect she has never lived a life of domestic simplicity. The few rings on her fingers are dull, not glittering, but they announce her authority as clearly as a sheriff's badge might. You step closer, and her expression shifts only slightly, a faint curl of the lip that suggests both amusement and suspicion. She is the keeper, the mistress of this house, the accountant of pleasures and penalties alike. City ordinances often required such brothel managers to be women, because male keepers were thought more likely to exploit the workers violently, though exploitation clearly ran deep no matter who held the keys. Still, the presence of a woman at the helm was seen as a kind of civic safeguard, a reminder that even in tolerated sin, there must be some veneer of order. Her voice cuts through the room, low and steady. "You've coin, traveler." It is not a question, but a demand for proof. You nod, though she has already judged the answer by the state of your cloak and boots. She gestures toward a table near her, where an abacus lies waiting, beads worn smooth by years of tallying. Next to it, a ledger sits open, the ink glistening faintly in the candlelight. This is no romantic den. It is an office, as much as it is a hall of flesh. Historians still argue whether brothel mistresses were respected businesswomen or simply tolerated outcasts. Records show some were wealthy enough to lend money, buy property, even sue in court. Others were barely scraping by, trapped in the same cycle as the workers they managed. In either case, they were enforcers of rules laid down by city councils, rules that dictated how many women could live in the house, what colors they must wear, and how much tax the keeper must remit each quarter. She runs a hand over the ledger, then looks back at you. "The house takes its due," she says. You understand that means any coin you spend here passes first through her grasp. It is her job to ensure that workers pay their debts, that clients pay their fees, and that officials receive their taxes. She is less madam than middle manager of vice, one whose success depends not on indulgence but on strict bookkeeping. You notice her eyes flick once toward a girl across the hall, who quickly straightens and hurries to refill a mug. That single glance communicates volumes, authority enforced not by shouting, but by a quiet, constant reminder that someone is always watching. A quirky tidbit drifts into your mind. In some German towns, brothel mistresses were required to wear keys at their belt as a sign of office, much like a jailer. Whether she carries keys now or not, the weight of invisible authority hangs heavy around her waist. She studies you a moment longer, then nods almost imperceptibly, as though granting you temporary passage into her domain. But the way she lingers tells you she will not forget your face, nor the purse at your side. Her job is to keep track of coin, of behavior, of those who come and go. The hall behind you buzzes on, but you feel her gaze even as you shift away. It's like standing under the eye of a magistrate while trying to pretend you're just here for the ale. You realize that in this world, indulgence is less about desire and more about negotiation. Contracts made silently between keeper and patron, each side pretending it is pleasure, when in truth it is transaction. The mistress turns back to her ledger, dipping a quill into ink, scratching figures onto the page with brisk strokes. You catch sight of columns marked with names, or perhaps aliases, and amounts owed. Debts, fines, taxes. She is not just a hostess. She is an archivist of survival, keeping records that might one day testify in a courtroom or before a city council. The brothel is not merely a house of night. It is a business, tangled with civic life, and she is the one threading the knots. A thought creeps into your head. Historians still argue whether such women wielded real power or were merely scapegoats for the moral failings of men. Some chronicles condemn them as greedy, merciless figures who preyed on workers and clients alike. Others describe them as reluctant managers, caught between civic law, church censure, and the endless grind of keeping both customers and officials satisfied. Standing before this mistress, you sense the truth is less glamorous than either version. She is tired, calculating, perhaps cynical, but above all, she is determined to keep her house running. A man stumbles past, nearly colliding with her table. Without rising, she snaps his name. How she knows it, you can only guess. And he freezes, mumbles an apology, and retreats. You notice how quickly authority can silence even the drunkest patron here. This is her domain, and the illusion of freedom dissolves the moment she intervenes. You find yourself oddly fascinated, watching her fingers tap the abacus, sliding beads with precise little clicks. In another setting, she might be a merchant tallying trade goods, or a steward accounting for a noble household. But here, the numbers measure something less tangible. Desperation, indulgence, the fragile balance between what people seek and what they can afford. The candle sputters beside her, throwing long shadows across the ledger. You imagine how many names have passed under her quill, how many debts have been tallied and never repaid. And you realize the mistress is less a temptress and more a mirror of the entire system. Cold, transactional, watching. Her eye weighs you still, even when she seems to look away. As you turn back toward the hall, the sounds swell again. Laughter too brittle, music too shaky, voices too eager. But now you hear them differently. Every mug raised, every coin dropped onto a table is first measured by the mistress. Her presence reshapes the room, and you begin to suspect that in this place, the sharpest danger is not the raucous laughter, not the smoke, not even the threat of disease whispered in corners, but the constant eye of the keeper who ensures that nothing, and no one, slips through her grasp. The longer you linger inside, the more obvious it becomes that the clientele gathered here are not the swaggering figures of bawdy tales or the dashing rogues painted in Renaissance woodcuts. They are men of bone-deep weariness, cloaked not in romance, but in dust and debt. The first you notice is a merchant, his cloak patched at the shoulder where the fabric has frayed from endless journeys between fairs. He holds his mug as though it is a lifeline, staring into the murky ale with the concentration of a man hoping to find fortune at the bottom. His lips move faintly, perhaps counting expenses, perhaps whispering prayers, though his eyes betray calculation more than devotion. At the next table, two apprentices sit shoulder to shoulder, their hands still marked by the day's labor. One has ink smudges across his knuckles, betraying hours spent copying contracts or tallying ledgers, while the other has calluses so thick that even the flickering candlelight cannot soften their roughness. They laugh too loudly, forcing merriment into their voices, as though it were another chore to be completed before sleep. Their gazes flit toward the women, not with lust so much as nervous curiosity, the way boys might eye a dangerous animal from behind a fence. Near the hearth, a pair of travelers slump in their seats, boots stretched out, cloaks damp with road dust. Their shoulders sag in unison, a tableau of fatigue. One pokes at a crust of bread, too stale to chew without effort, while the other coughs quietly into his sleeve, a sound that ripples unease across the nearby tables. People glance, frown, then look away quickly, unwilling to admit that the shared air of this crowded hall could betray them all. Historians still argue whether brothels were seen as places of indulgence or simply as another shelter for the weary. But here, the evidence tilts firmly toward the latter. It is strange how ordinary these men appear. You had perhaps imagined crimson robes, gold chains, or the flamboyant swagger of noble gallants. Instead, you see men with tired eyes, muddy boots, and hands stained from labor. The brothel, for all its whispered infamy, is in practice a place where the common and the weary gather, hoping for distraction from the monotony of survival. A man at the far end of the table catches your attention. His cloak is better cut than the others, though frayed at the hem, and he wears a narrow belt studded with tiny brass fittings. He speaks in low tones to a woman perched beside him, but you notice his fingers tapping a nervous rhythm against the table. He is no noble, but perhaps a minor guildsman, anxious about debts or contracts. The woman nods absently, her eyes drifting toward the mistress's table, waiting for the signal that her time has expired. You feel a pang of disappointment as you take in the room. Folklore promised bawdy revels, yet the reality is hushed, uneasy. The laughter rings hollow, like bells cracked by overuse. Jokes are told, but they collapse into silence almost before the punchline lands. A quirky tidbit drifts to mind. In some medieval towns, ordinances required brothels to close during major religious festivals so that the noise of sin would not drown out the solemnity of processions. Judging by the subdued atmosphere here, the noise of sin hardly seems the problem. It is the echo of fatigue that dominates. At one table, a man with a weather-beaten face rolls dice across the wood, the clatter sharp in the murky air. He cheers when the numbers favor him, though no one else seems to care. His opponent, lips pressed tight, hands over a few small coins without protest. Gambling in such houses was often discouraged by city officials, who feared fights breaking out. But here the mistress seems content to let the dice roll. Perhaps she has calculated that small quarrels cost less than outright prohibitions. You pass by another group, young men no older than 20, jostling each other with forced bravado. Their laughter is sharper, more brittle, each trying to outdo the others in wit, though the words tumble clumsily, as though they are unsure whether they are joking or confessing. One leans too far back on his stool and nearly topples, provoking a round of guffaws. The sound carries briefly, lifting the mood of the hall before sputtering back into the dim hum. Historians still argue whether patrons visited brothels primarily for intimacy, for food and drink, or for the simple act of belonging to a group. Looking at these faces, you suspect that the line between motives was thin, perhaps non-existent. For some it is ale, for others companionship, for others still the relief of anonymity in a crowd. What unites them all is the desire to forget, at least for a few hours, the burdens of labor, debt, or loneliness. You find a seat along the edge, the wood sticky from spilled ale, and observe more closely. The room is thick with contradictions. Voices speaking of laughter, but eyes heavy with weariness. Gestures that suggest revelry, but sagging shoulders that betray exhaustion. It feels less like a carnival and more like a waiting room, a liminal space where people hold their breath and pretend to enjoy themselves until dawn gives them an excuse to leave. A man nearby leans in, muttering something about the city watch. His words are slurred, but you catch enough to understand that even the guards find their way here, trading coin for silence as much as for services. That detail resonates. Records from several towns confirm that officials, priests, and guards were as likely as merchants to appear in brothels, each cloaked in hypocrisy, yet welcomed for the taxes their visits supported. The fiddler scrapes his bow across the strings again, coaxing a thin melody that meanders without direction. Someone claps along, half in jest, until the rhythm collapses. A mug tips, ale spreading in a puddle that seeps toward your boot. You pull it away just in time, the liquid gleaming in the candlelight before sinking into the rushes. The smell of stale beer intensifies, and the fiddler chuckles awkwardly, as though even he recognizes that his music is less performance than background noise. Another figure catches your attention, a man in clerical garb, or at least part of one. His cloak is patched, his tonsure overgrown, but the outline of a cleric remains. He sits alone, eyes darting nervously, a mug clutched so tightly that his knuckles whiten. The sight is not as unusual as it might seem. Accounts survive of priests visiting such places, despite the church's constant denunciations. Some chroniclers called them hypocrites, others simply resigned to human weakness. Whether this man seeks comfort or merely shelter, you cannot tell. But his presence underscores the contradictions humming in the air. You lean back, the bench creaking beneath you, and take in the room once more. This is not the riotous theater of lust painted by moralists, nor the gilded fantasy of later artists. It is a dim, smoky hall where tired men gather with tired jokes, their pleasures muted, their laughter forced. The clientele's reality is less scandalous and more ordinary, a mirror of the broader world, full of debt, labor, fatigue, and the thin hope that perhaps tonight will feel different, even if it rarely does. And as you sit among them, watching the smoke curl upward and the dice tumble across the scarred table, you begin to realize that the real story of this place lies not in wild indulgence, but in the quiet ordinariness of survival disguised as festivity. You shift slightly on the hard bench, and your eyes begin to trace the women who move between the tables. Their faces, lit in fragments by the stubborn flames of tallow candles, reveal not seduction, but fatigue. The stories you've heard, bright-eyed women with laughter bubbling like wine, melt away as you notice the truth. Shadows under eyes, careful smiles, and shoulders that sag when no one is looking. The working women of this house do not glide like dancers. They tread carefully, balancing trays of ale, carrying whispered promises, moving as if their bodies themselves are ledger entries waiting to be collected. Their routine is exhausting, you realize. The night has only just begun, and already their energy appears borrowed. During the day, many of them launder sheets, sweep floors, or sew torn garments. The brothel mistress demands that the rooms appear somewhat respectable for the next night's cycle. Rest comes in fragments, if at all. Historians still argue whether brothel workers in licensed houses enjoyed more protection than those who lived in the shadows of the streets. Some evidence suggests that civic authorities believed regulation created safety, requiring regular health checks, limiting the number of women, or mandating distinctive dress so they could not blend unnoticed into the crowd. Others argue that these regulations only deepened stigma, ensuring that once marked, women could never easily leave the profession. Looking at the women here, you suspect both might be true. One woman pauses at your table, her hair bound under a kerchief that has slipped sideways after hours of wear. Her hands are strong, the nails broken, the skin reddened. You remember reading that women in such houses often had to buy their own clothing, sometimes from the very mistress who employed them, creating a cycle of debt. That knowledge makes her patched gown appear heavier than its fabric should allow. She places a mug before you and offers a smile, but it is not the coy smile of art or song. It is professional, like the bow of a shopkeeper. The smile fades quickly once she turns, her shoulders dropping a little before she approaches the next table. At another corner, two women whisper together as they fold a length of linen. You catch words about a missing comb, about who owes coin to whom, about the mistress's warnings. They sound less like rivals and more like co-workers in a workshop, grumbling about quotas. A quirky fact floats into your mind. In certain medieval towns, workers were required to attend church services weekly, even while wearing distinctive veils marking their trade. Imagine kneeling at Mass with everyone staring, reminded that your place in society was permitted, but never respected. You glance again at the mistress, who seems to monitor these women as carefully as she monitors the patrons. A flick of her eye sends one scurrying toward the stairs, perhaps to prepare a room. Another glance redirects a woman who lingers too long near a dice game. Authority flows constantly from her gaze, reshaping the paths of the women like a shepherd's crook guiding sheep. The women's exhaustion becomes clearer the longer you watch. One stifles a yawn behind her sleeve, then forces laughter at a patron's joke. Another sways slightly, her knees trembling after hours of standing. You think of how songs and poems depict brothels as sites of endless carnal energy, but the human body has limits. Fatigue cannot be painted over forever. And the rules, always the rules. City statutes dictated not only the clothing, but sometimes the hours when these women could appear outside the brothel. In one city, they were forbidden from wearing pearls or gold. In another, they could not ride in carriages. Their very existence was mapped by civic control, as if each woman were a point on a ledger, not a person. Historians still argue whether these restrictions aimed to protect respectable women or merely to brand others as untouchable. Either way, the results are the same: separation, stigma, exhaustion. You catch the sound of a cough from upstairs, muffled through the beams. A worker's voice follows, sharp with frustration. Perhaps someone refusing to pay, or perhaps a woman reminding another that time is short and debts are long. You recall records describing how fines were imposed on workers who disobeyed rules, late to meals, caught with forbidden clothing, or missing from church. Every misstep became another entry in the mistress's ledger, another stone in the wall of debt. A man nearby clumsily reaches for a woman's sleeve, but she slips away smoothly, practiced in evasion. Her laugh is polite, but hollow, carrying no warmth. It strikes you that these women have mastered not only the art of allure, but also the art of avoidance, a constant dance between engagement and escape. The fiddler begins another tune, and one woman sways gently beside him, humming under her breath. The melody is simple, repetitive, almost like a lullaby. Her face softens as she sings, as though in that moment she forgets where she stands. Perhaps the tune reminds her of home, of childhood, of anything beyond these walls. You realize music offers brief relief, a borrowed breath of humanity amid the heavy air. A quirky tidbit again surfaces. Some brothels, according to records, employed women not only for sexual services, but also to cook meals, mend clothes, or even provide singing for patrons. The house blurred the line between tavern, inn, and workshop, forcing the women to wear a dozen masks in a single evening. Looking at them now, you see that exhaustion etched into their movements. You sip the weak ale, its flavor flat and watery, and feel a flicker of guilt. You are here as an observer, cushioned by centuries, while they lived this reality with no escape. The glamour of legend has crumbled entirely. What remains is labor, fatigue, and the constant negotiation of survival. Another patron beckons, and a woman crosses the hall to him, adjusting her gown as she walks. She sits carefully, hands folded on her lap, waiting for his first words. He mutters about losing coin at dice, his breath sour with drink. She listens with practiced patience, nodding occasionally, her eyes unfocused. You suspect she has heard the same laments 1,000 times, each one indistinguishable from the last. Historians still argue whether such women possessed any agency, whether they chose this work, whether they carved out pockets of independence, or whether they were bound entirely by the structures around them. The debate continues in classrooms and books, But here, in the smoke and dimness, the truth feels slippery. They are both trapped and resourceful, exploited and resilient, weary yet enduring. The fiddler's tune ends. The laughter fades again. The mistress tallies her accounts. And the women, those weary, resilient workers, return to their endless tasks. You realize then that their day never truly ends. When the patrons leave, there will be sheets to wash, floors to scrub, debts to count. By the time dawn paints the sky, their labor will still be unfinished. And tomorrow night, the cycle will begin again, with more smiles, more fatigue, more survival. And as you watch one woman adjust her kerchief and turn toward the stairs, you wonder whether you could last a single night under such rules, such fatigue, such unrelenting expectation. The answer, whispered by every movement in the hall, is no. The evening drags further on, and your stomach growls faintly. You notice the long wooden tables near the back of the hall, lined with bowls and trenchers, where a sort of supper has been set out for patrons and workers alike. You decide to wander closer, hoping to find something that resembles a meal, though the sight that greets you is far from appetizing. The food is as tired as the faces around it. A thick stew bubbles half-heartedly in a blackened pot, its surface gleaming with a film of fat that shifts sluggishly whenever someone dips in a ladle. Chunks of turnip float like pale islands amid darker scraps of meat whose origin you dare not guess. Beside the pot lies a basket of bread, loaves so stale that they seem better suited for masonry than for eating. Still, a man takes one, breaks it with effort, and dunks it into the stew with a resigned grunt. You recall that bread in the medieval world was not always pure wheat. Often it was mixed with rye, barley, or even ground peas. On lean days, bakers stretched flour with ground beans or acorns. And here, in this brothel's kitchen corner, the bread tastes exactly as history warns. Dry, coarse, filling only by force. You chew slowly, each bite scraping at your teeth, and wonder if the women who work here ever dream of softer loaves sold in the market stalls they rarely reach. The ale flows freely, though freely is a cruel joke. The liquid is thin, barely more than water tinged with the ghost of barley. Patrons gulp it anyway, perhaps out of habit more than pleasure. You sip cautiously, the flavor flat, metallic, carrying the faint aftertaste of the cask. A quirky tidbit drifts to mind. Ale in the medieval period was safer than much of the water, as the brewing process killed off some dangerous microbes. Yet in places like this, the ale was so weak, it served more as hydration than intoxication. And so the patrons drink, refilling mugs, convincing themselves that each swallow carries merriment, when in truth it only delays thirst. On the table beside the bread lies a slab of cheese, its rind cracked and tough, the inside sharp enough to make your jaw tighten. A knife sticks in it like a stake, waiting for anyone to carve off a piece. You hesitate, then cut a sliver, chewing carefully. It is strong, pungent, clinging to your tongue long after you swallow. The man across from you, already red in the cheeks from his mug, grins and declares, "Better than nothing." You are not entirely convinced. One of the women carries a tray with bowls of pottage, placing them before two apprentices. They lean in, spoons scraping loudly, as though the sound itself fills them with comfort. The woman lingers for a moment, watching to make sure they eat, and then drifts away. Her expression is unreadable, perhaps pity, perhaps habit. You think again of how their duties extend beyond the services imagined in bawdy songs. They cook, they serve, They clean, they host, they labor endlessly, and meals like this are part of the package. The hall smells now of stew and smoke, mingling with sweat and ale. It is not unpleasant exactly, but heavy, as though every scent clings to your cloak with greedy fingers. You wipe your hands on a cloth, though the fabric is as greasy as your palms. Around you, men eat quickly, as if afraid the food might vanish before their hunger is sated. Their chatter rises in pitch, voices louder after each gulp of ale, yet the merriment feels forced. Historians still argue whether brothels provided meals primarily as a courtesy to clients or as a way to ensure patrons lingered and spent more coin. Surviving records mention stew pots, bread, and ale rations, but the tone of those notes shifts, sometimes indulgent, sometimes resentful. Here, standing amid chipped bowls and cracked loaves, the truth feels plain enough. Food is another commodity, another reason to keep bodies in seats and purses in reach. You notice how the workers themselves eat, standing in corners, scooping food quickly between duties. One woman crouches near the hearth, dipping bread into stew while keeping one eye on the mistress. Another nibbles cheese behind her sleeve, chewing with the haste of someone who has only seconds before being called away again. Meals are less communal gathering and more stolen moments of survival. At the far end of the table, a man sings under his breath, a slurred tune about knights and maidens. His voice is cracked, yet he persists, spoon clattering between verses. No one joins in, though one apprentice taps the table in rhythm. The song stumbles, fades, then dissolves into laughter when he forgets the words. You cannot help but smile faintly, though the humor lies more in exhaustion than in joy. A quirky fact nudges at you. Some medieval ordinances forbade brothels from serving extravagant meals to prevent them from competing with taverns. If the law was followed here, it shows. The stew is filling, but unremarkable. The ale weak, the bread coarse. These meals are designed to sustain, not delight. And yet, for many of the men here, it may be the most reliable hot food they will eat all week. The fiddler pauses his bow to gulp from a mug, then belches loudly enough to draw a scowl from the mistress. He shrugs, mutters something about too much pottage, and launches back into another crooked tune. The women pass by again with trays, collecting empty bowls, refilling mugs. Their steps never cease, and you begin to marvel at their endurance. One patron complains loudly that the bread has chipped his tooth, slamming the loaf back into the basket. His friends laugh, teasing him with exaggerated grimaces. The man grins sheepishly, then takes another bite anyway. You wonder how many teeth are lost to meals like this, how many aches and pains never find relief. As the stew pot empties, the mistress appears, nodding for a serving girl to fetch another ladle. Her presence ensures no one steals more than their portion. No one pockets a crust for later. The control extends to every corner. Food, drink, laughter, coin. Nothing escapes her tally. You finish your bread, swallow the last watery sip of ale, and lean back. Your stomach is fuller, though hardly satisfied. Around you, men slump against benches, bellies heavy, voices rising in half-hearted songs. A man to your left mutters that he will gamble his last coin after supper, while another swears he will win it all back before dawn. The promises feel as stale as the bread. Historians still argue whether meals in brothels created a sense of camaraderie or merely prolonged the transaction. Sitting here, you suspect the latter. The food binds patrons together only in shared mediocrity, another layer of routine that blurs one night into the next. You glance at the hearth again, where a woman kneels to scrape ashes into a bucket. Her hands move quickly, practiced, her face expressionless. She finishes, rises, and disappears up the stairs without a word. The hall continues to buzz around you, thick with smoke and chatter, yet her silent departure lingers in your mind. The meal ends not with satisfaction, but with weary acceptance. Patrons push back from tables, wipe crumbs from beards, and return to dice, songs, or murmured negotiations. The mistress tallies mugs and bowls, her ledger growing heavier. The women resume their circuits, shoulders hunched but eyes watchful. You realize then that food here is less about nourishment and more about endurance. The stew sustains, the ale hydrates, the bread fills space in the belly. Comfort is absent, but survival persists. And in this place, perhaps survival itself is the only indulgence anyone can truly afford. When the meal fades into memory and the last mugs are collected, the mistress gestures for a serving girl to lead you up a narrow staircase. The steps creak beneath your boots, each one sounding as though the timber would prefer to collapse under the weight of so many who have climbed them before. The air grows closer as you ascend, the smoke from below mingling with the heavy smell of sweat and mildew that clings to the upper chambers. You pass a landing where a shutter hangs crookedly, allowing a thin draft to slip through. The breeze should be refreshing, but it carries the odor of the alley outside. Rot, dung, and stagnant water. The draft whirls briefly in the stairwell, lifting the edges of your cloak before vanishing again. When you reach the top, the serving girl pauses, pushes open a door with her hip, and motions you inside. The room is smaller than you imagined, a box of timber and plaster with just enough space for a narrow bed. And a chipped pitcher resting on a table. The walls lean inward, as though weary from holding themselves upright. A single candle sputters in an iron holder, throwing long shadows across the ceiling beams. Dust gathers in the corners, thick enough to trace shapes with your finger. You approach the bed, though calling it a bed seems generous. It is a low wooden frame filled with straw, the stuffing flattened into lumps by years of restless bodies. The straw smells faintly of mildew, mixed with the sharper tang of sweat that no amount of laundering seems able to remove. The linen cover is coarse, patched in places. It seems uneven, where they have been stitched again and again. You press your hand against the surface and feel the rustle of straw beneath, some stalks sharp enough to prick through the fabric. The serving girl sets down a mug of ale and withdraws without a word, leaving you alone. You sit carefully, the bed groaning under your weight. The straw shifts uneasily, creating a hollow that cradles your body at an odd angle. You imagine trying to sleep here, your back bent, your limbs aching by dawn. The thought alone makes your shoulders tense. Historians still argue whether medieval bedding was truly this uncomfortable, or whether records exaggerate conditions in order to shame brothels. Some accounts describe clean linens changed weekly, while others speak of vermin-infested straw left untouched for months. Standing here in the flickering candlelight, the truth feels closer to the latter. The smell clings, the fabric scratches, and every shift of your body sends up a faint rustle that reminds you of animals rooting in hay. A quirky tidbit surfaces. Some brothels were rumored to scatter aromatic herbs into the bedding, lavender, rosemary, or mint, to mask the odors. Whether this was a genuine practice or merely wishful thinking is unclear, but you detect no such fragrance here. Instead, the air is thick with dampness, the kind that seeps into bones and leaves you shivering even under a blanket. You lie back cautiously, feeling the uneven surface press against your spine. The straw crinkles like dry leaves, and you wonder how many other bodies have left their shape imprinted here. The candle flickers, casting shadows that stretch like claws across the ceiling. You close your eyes, trying to imagine drifting into sleep, but every sound intrudes. Footsteps in the corridor, muffled laughter from downstairs, a cough that rattles through the walls. The bed offers no escape from noise, only a reminder of how thin the walls are and how crowded the house remains. You shift again, pulling the coarse linen tighter around you. It scratches against your skin, refusing comfort. Sleep in such a place must come less from restfulness and more from sheer exhaustion. The women who work here surely collapse into these same beds after hours of labor, finding not luxury, but necessity. Rest is never restorative, only a pause before the next cycle begins. The stool near the table wobbles when you touch it, its legs uneven from years of use. The pitcher holds water that tastes faintly of iron, leaving a metallic tang on your tongue. You spit it back, realizing the ale downstairs, weak though it was, is safer. The chamber lacks warmth. The hearth below does not reach this far, and the shutters leak cold air. You pull your cloak around you, imagining how winter nights must feel here. Fingers stiff, breath visible, bodies huddled together, not from desire, but from the need to keep warm. The candle guttering beside you reminds you of how fragile light was in these spaces. A sudden draft nearly extinguishes it, plunging the room into near darkness before the flame steadies again. You realize that in many medieval houses, fire was both comfort and terror, the only source of light, yet a constant risk of disaster. Brothels, filled with straw bedding and wooden walls, must have lived in perpetual fear of a stray spark. Your eyes wander back to the bed, and you cannot help but laugh quietly. This is the grand accommodation, the chamber of rest for patrons who imagined indulgence. A bed that pricks, linen that scratches, air that chills. So much for romance. You roll onto your side, feeling the straw shift like sand beneath you, and you wonder whether you would last more than a few hours before fleeing back to the street. You think again of how myths embellish brothels with velvet cushions, perfumed sheets, and silk draperies. The reality could not be further removed. Perhaps in wealthy districts, nobles enjoyed such luxuries. But here, in the heart of the licensed quarter, comfort has no place. Only survival matters. Bodies moving through cycles of labor, patrons paying for distraction, beds holding the weary until dawn. Historians still argue whether such discomfort was intentional, a way for city officials to ensure brothels did not become too alluring, or whether it was simply the result of poverty. Regulations often forbade excessive luxury, insisting that brothels remain distinct from inns. Whether enforced or not, the result here is plain enough. This is no inn, no haven of rest. It is a holding pen for the tired, the drunk, the desperate. You pull the coarse blanket tighter, though it does little to soften the prickling straw beneath. The sounds from the hall drift upward again, dice clattering, mugs clinking, laughter rising, then falling into silence. You feel the weight of the night pressing down, each sound a reminder that peace is absent here. Even in solitude, you cannot escape the restless hum of the house. The candle burns lower, its wax pooling unevenly. Shadows thicken around you, the corners of the chamber darkening into shapes that your tired mind mistakes for figures. You blink, rub your eyes, remind yourself that they are the only tricks of the light. Still, unease settles in your chest, and you wonder, lying on this scratchy bed, whether anyone ever truly rested in these rooms. Sleep, perhaps. Rest, never. The candle burns low, and you drift back toward the murmur of the hall below. Curiosity tugs you from the straw bed, So you rise and follow the narrow corridor until it spills into a gallery that overlooks the main room. From here, you can see more clearly how the brothel functions, not as a place of unchecked chaos, but as a carefully managed business. At the far end of the hall, the mistress sits once again with her ledger. Her quill scratches steadily, the sound faint yet relentless, like an insect trapped in wood. Every coin passed across a table, every mug filled, every bed claimed, all of it is tallied. She is less madam and more bureaucrat, her authority rooted not only in presence, but in numbers. You realize suddenly that this house survives not by indulgence alone, but by mathematics. In many medieval cities, brothels were licensed by civic councils. Officials believed that by regulating vice, they could control it. The mistress pays her dues regularly, a set fee for the house itself, additional taxes for each worker, sometimes even fines for disorderly conduct. These payments flow into the coffers of the city, funding bridges, walls, even church repairs. The irony is sharp, the wages of sin paving the way for sanctity. Historians still argue whether this arrangement represented pragmatic governance or cynical hypocrisy. Standing here, watching the mistress push beads along her abacus, you suspect it was both. A clerk arrives at the door, his robe dusty from the streets, his satchel heavy with parchment. The mistress greets him not with deference, but with the mutual acknowledgement of two professionals. He produces a small scroll. She produces a pouch of coins. They exchange with efficiency, each counting twice. When finished, the clerk bows slightly and departs, leaving her to tally once more in her ledger. The transaction is mundane, yet its meaning profound. This brothel, condemned by sermons, is upheld by law, its very survival dependent on paperwork and tax rolls. A quirky tidbit slips into your memory. In some towns, civic officials required brothels to fly small flags or paint their doors red, not only to mark their trade, but to prove they were licensed. In theory, this meant authorities could monitor and tax them more easily. Whether the system reduced disorder is debatable, but the symbols themselves became notorious, warnings and advertisements at once. You glance toward the entrance below and imagine a painted swan or faded banner once hanging there, announcing compliance as much as availability. Back in the hall, the mistress closes her ledger with a sharp snap. She surveys the room, and you realize her role is part accountant, part magistrate, part watchful mother. Patrons who shout too loudly are silenced with a glance. A woman lingering too long is dispatched with a nod. Even the fiddler falls quiet when she frowns, his bow stilled mid-note. Authority here does not roar. It counts, calculates, and controls. You lean on the railing, feeling the wood sticky with old spills. Below you, two men argue over dice. Their voices rise, but before the dispute grows violent, the mistress signals to a servant. Within moments, mugs of ale appear at the table, smoothing tempers with distraction. The conflict fizzles, replaced by the familiar sound of coins clinking. This, too, is regulation, not by city statutes, but by the careful manipulation of appetite and distraction. Historians still argue whether such regulation protected women or exploited them further. The city took its taxes, the mistress enforced her rules, but the workers themselves remained caught in the middle. Some chronicles describe women appealing to courts for better treatment, while others paint them as perpetual debtors, trapped by the very system meant to oversee them. The debate persists because records reveal fragments but rarely voices. Watching now, you sense that truth lies in the silence of those women's steps, in their careful eyes, in the way they carry trays without complaint. A group of younger men enter, cloaks damp from the night air. They glance around nervously, as though stepping into a forbidden temple. The mistress intercepts them, counting coins before allowing them farther inside. The exchange is quick, practiced. Even here, before merriment begins, the law is enforced in copper and silver. You imagine the civic official who will tally those coins tomorrow, never once considering the faces behind them. A man at the dice table slams his fist when he loses, scattering coins. The mistress does not move, but two larger patrons rise from benches, collecting the money calmly and handing it back. Order is restored within minutes. You realize that enforcement here is decentralized. The house itself polices its members, bound by shared interest in avoiding the watch's intrusion. Disorder brings fines. Fines bring debt. And debt threatens survival. A candle sputters below, wax dripping onto the table where two clerks once sat. You wonder if even they, men sworn to uphold civic order, sometimes lingered here. Records suggest it often happened. Clerks, guards, even priests found their way into brothels. Their presence tolerated so long as taxes were paid. The cycle becomes clearer to you with each observation. Condemnation in public, consumption in private, regulation in law. The mistress stands again, keys jangling faintly at her belt. She makes her rounds, pausing at each table, speaking briefly, counting coins, observing bowls and mugs. Her authority is absolute, though she wields it with a calm efficiency rather than cruelty. She is the living embodiment of civic compromise, the figure who ensures that the brothel remains profitable, orderly, and most importantly, taxable. You descend from the gallery, returning to the hall. The smells grow thicker: stew, ale, smoke, sweat, and you find yourself coughing softly. A patron claps you on the shoulder, laughing at your discomfort. "First time, eh?" he says, though you detect sympathy in his tone. Perhaps he too remembers his first night here, the realization that reality weighs heavier than legend. You watch as another clerk enters, this one in finer clothes, perhaps an official's assistant. He receives a sealed pouch from the mistress and scribbles a note on parchment. The transaction is swift, routine. To the city, this house is not scandal, but income, no different than a mill or tannery. You cannot help but marvel at the paradox. Sermons thunder against vice, yet the very stones of the city are maintained by its profit. A quirky note resurfaces. Some towns earmarked brothel taxes specifically for public works like bridge repairs. Imagine crossing a sturdy bridge while priests denounced the sins that funded it. The irony must have been thick enough to choke on, though perhaps most people simply shrugged and walked on. As the mistress returns to her ledger, you realize how relentless her task is. Every coin, every bowl, every bed, recorded, counted, taxed. She is not here to indulge, not here to revel. She is here to manage. And in doing so, she reveals the true nature of this place. Not scandal, not pleasure, but bureaucracy disguised in smoke and ale. The hall swells with noise again, dice clattering, mugs slamming, laughter forced. Yet above it all, you hear the steady scratch of the quill, the sound of survival written line by line. And you begin to understand that a medieval brothel was less a den of sin and more a ledger with walls, its inhabitants trapped between desire and debt, overseen always by the calm, watchful eye of regulation. The hall grows louder, but in the spaces between dice rolls and fiddlers' squeaks, you begin to notice another thread of conversation. Low whispers traded in corners, words that make the air colder than the draft through the shutters. The talk is of illness. You hear the word pox more than once, murmured with dread, spat into mugs as though speaking it aloud might spread it further. You edge closer to one group of men hunched over a table, their voices rough with unease. One leans in, tugging at the collar of his tunic, and mutters about a friend who visited another house down the street and came away with sores that would not heal. Another shakes his head grimly, insisting he's heard the same from 3 others. A third insists it is a punishment from God, nodding toward the church bells, tolling faintly in the distance. Historians still argue whether the French disease, as it was later called, truly emerged in Europe after the late 15th century, or whether earlier outbreaks existed under other names. Some argue that medieval brothels were already hotbeds of syphilis long before Columbus returned from the New World, while others believe the timelines simply don't align. Standing here, centuries collapsed into imagination. You realize the uncertainty mattered less to those who lived it. To them, disease was an unseen companion, stalking every handshake, every kiss, every whispered exchange. A woman passes nearby carrying a tray, and you notice her limp. Her face is pale, her smile wan. You wonder if she too carries the weight of sickness beneath her gown, hidden yet undeniable. Another woman coughs as she sets down mugs, quickly covering her mouth, eyes darting to see who noticed. The patrons do notice, but like you, they say nothing. Silence is easier than admitting fear. A quirky tidbit surfaces from memory. Crocodile dung was once used in ancient contraceptive recipes, a bizarre attempt to ward off unwanted pregnancy. In medieval brothels, methods were far cruder. Linen soaked in vinegar, mixtures of herbs, or prayers murmured hurriedly. None were reliable. Disease and pregnancy alike haunted every embrace, shadows that lingered longer than any moment of pleasure. You shift uncomfortably on the bench as the whispers continue. Some men insist garlic or wine can ward off infection. Others swear by pilgrimages to shrines, the purchase of blessed amulets, or the application of ointments sold by apothecaries who promised much and delivered little. The debate grows heated, one man swearing that only abstinence can save them, his companions laughing bitterly at the absurdity of such advice here. The fiddler strikes a louder chord, trying to drown the unease, but even his tune cannot erase the undercurrent. The smell of sweat mingles with the sour tang of fear. You realize that the danger here is not merely physical discomfort, not merely debt or exhaustion, but the invisible specter of sickness that lingers in every corner. A man near the hearth suddenly pulls back his sleeve to reveal blotches along his arm. His companions recoil, muttering prayers, but he only laughs harshly, insisting it is nothing. The mistress notices and strides across the room. She speaks sharply, too quietly for you to hear, and the man is ushered out by 2 others. The door slams behind him, the echo lingering like a cough in the air. You glance around and see how quickly the room pretends nothing happened. Dice roll again, mugs clink, voices rise. But beneath it all, you sense a tightening, a shared knowledge that no one truly escapes. The brothel thrives on routine, yet disease thrives just as well. Both are relentless. Both are unavoidable. Historians still argue whether medieval regulations on brothels, such as mandatory health inspections, were genuinely enforced or simply written for appearances. Some records describe physicians visiting houses monthly, checking for visible signs of illness. Others dismiss such visits as rare, more symbolic than real. Watching the pale faces, the coughs hastily stifled, you suspect enforcement was light at best. After all, the city needed taxes more than it needed healthy workers. You sip from your mug, the ale flat and watery, and imagine the taste of medicine instead. Mercury, arsenic, or other concoctions once prescribed to cure the incurable. Those cures often proved worse than the sickness, leaving patients weakened or dead. Yet desperate people tried anything, clinging to hope even as it poisoned them. The hall grows hotter, bodies pressed close, air thick with breath. You wipe your brow, uneasy. Each cough, each sniffle, each pale face feels like a warning. The dice clatter again. Laughter rises. But you cannot shake the weight of what you've heard. At another table, a man in clerical robes insists that sin itself breeds disease, that God punishes the wicked through sores and fevers. His words carry loudly, though his own flushed face betrays too many mugs of ale. Patrons roll their eyes, one muttering that priests always condemn the very vices they secretly indulge. The irony is sharp, the hypocrisy sharper still. The fiddler shifts into a livelier tune, and for a moment the room sways with him, voices rising in song. Yet the memory of that blotched arm, of the coughing woman, lingers in your mind. Pleasure here is fleeting, but the consequences last longer than dawn. You glance toward the mistress again. She has resumed her ledger, but her eyes flicker often toward the women, toward the patrons, scanning for signs she cannot control. Regulation can track coins, can dictate clothing, can set curfews, but it cannot banish sickness. Disease slips through ledgers and laws alike, leaving only silence and whispers in its wake. The fiddler's tune falters again, and this time a man at the dice table slaps the wood in irritation. "Enough with that racket," he growls, his voice carrying across the hall. Yet another patron, cheeks flushed from ale, calls for a song instead, banging his mug until froth spills over the rim. Within moments, the tension between noise and silence breaks, and the hall erupts in a jumble of sound. Dice rattling, voices raised in argument, a woman's laugh pitched too high to be natural. Entertainment, you realize, is a fragile mask here. Thin distractions pasted over the weight of fatigue and fear. The brothel offers not only bodies, but also noise. Songs to drown thought, games to blur memory, chatter to stifle silence. In this way, the hall becomes less a chamber of sin than a theater of distraction. You feel yourself swept into it, not by choice, but by sheer proximity. On one side, a group of apprentices lean close over dice, their eyes wide with the gleam of hope that tonight, fortune will smile. The cubes clatter across the scarred table, bouncing off grooves carved by countless games before. One boy cheers as he wins a handful of coins, while the others groan and protest. Their voices rise, drawing glances from nearby tables. But the mistress does not interfere. Gambling is risky, yes, but it keeps men seated, keeps them drinking, keeps the ledger full. Historians still argue whether brothels actively encouraged such games or simply tolerated them. Ordinances in some towns forbade dice play within licensed houses, fearing fights. But enforcement was lax when officials themselves enjoyed the games. Looking at these boys, their faces flushed with drink and desperation, you suspect the practice was inevitable. Dice required no elaborate stage, no instruments, no training. Just cubes, coin, and the fragile hope of luck. At another table, a merchant taps the rim of his mug in rhythm, singing a coarse song about a miller's daughter. His companions laugh, clapping along, though half the words are lost to slurred voices. The tune wanders, but the laughter rises, feeding on itself. One man leans back too far, nearly toppling from his bench, provoking howls of amusement. For a moment, the heaviness of earlier whispers fades, replaced by a brief illusion of joy. A quirky detail drifts into your memory. In certain towns, traveling minstrels were hired to perform in brothels, their songs often bawdy, filled with double meanings. Records even mention jesters and acrobats entertaining patrons, blurring the line between tavern, theater, and house of pleasure. Here, though, the music is rougher, more improvised. The fiddler scrapes half-heartedly at his strings, nodding along as the patrons' voices drown him out. The women, too, play their part in this performance. One hums softly as she pours ale, her voice weaving faintly through the din. Another claps in time with the dice, pretending interest in the game though her eyes wander elsewhere. Their movements are rehearsed, gestures of amusement meant to keep patrons engaged. It strikes you that they are performers, as much as they are workers, tasked with sustaining an atmosphere that convinces men they are enjoying themselves. A priestly figure near the hearth frowns at the noise, clutching his cloak tighter. Yet even he cannot resist the pull of the music. His foot taps faintly against the rushes. Perhaps he convinces himself that he listens only to study sin, not to enjoy it. You smile faintly, recognizing hypocrisy as common currency here, no less valuable than coin. The sound swells again as two men stand to dance, stomping clumsily on the uneven boards. Their boots thud, rattling mugs, and the crowd cheers half-heartedly. The dance is more parody than performance, their movements exaggerated for comic effect. One stumbles, crashes into a bench, and sprawls onto the floor, sending his companions into fits of laughter. He bows dramatically, soaking in the applause, before clambering back to his seat. Historians still argue whether such entertainments brought true joy, or merely postponed despair. Some chroniclers describe nights of riotous laughter, others nights of hollow noise that left patrons emptier than before. Observing now, you sense that both may be true. Laughter rises easily, but it vanishes quickly, leaving silence heavier than before. The fiddler shifts again, drawing his bow across the strings in a livelier reel. This time, the women encourage it, clapping softly, urging patrons to sing louder. The noise grows, spilling over the walls, though muffled by thick shutters. Outside, the bells of the nearby church toll the hour, their solemn notes slicing through the chaos. The contrast is jarring, judgment ringing over indulgence, sanctity echoing over sin. You glance at the faces around you, wondering how many hear the bells and shudder inwardly. A quirky tidbit comes to mind. In some cities, church bells were rung deliberately during the evening to remind citizens of curfew, a sonic boundary between permitted life and forbidden activity. To hear them from within a brothel must have been unnerving, a reminder that indulgence existed under the shadow of censure. Yet no one here leaves. The dice roll, the songs stumble on, the ale flows. Hypocrisy is ignored as long as the mugs remain full. One man rises and calls for a tale instead of a song. His voice booms, and soon the hall grows quieter. He tells a crude story about a knight, a pig, and a barn, words stumbling into laughter. The tale is absurd, full of exaggeration, yet it holds the crowd for a few minutes, offering escape from whispers of sickness and debt. The mistress herself allows a faint smile before returning to her ledger. Stories, too, are part of this economy, spun out like thread to patch over unease. You sip from your mug, though the ale tastes no better. The noise presses in, heavy, and you feel yourself caught between amusement and weariness. Every laugh sounds rehearsed, every cheer too sharp, every song too short. Entertainment here is constant yet unsatisfying, like chewing on stale bread that fills the mouth without ever satisfying hunger. Historians still argue whether brothels were truly places of pleasure or places of necessity, where people sought not joy, but distraction. Tonight leans toward the latter. The laughter is brittle, the music ragged, the games tinged with desperation. Yet without them, the silence would be unbearable, filled only with coughs, debts, and fear. The bells toll once more outside, their echo carrying through the shutters. Inside, the hall grows louder in defiance, as though noise itself could drown judgment. And you realize that this, too, is survival. Entertainment is armor, laughter is shield, noise is refuge against the weight of reality. You lean back, watching the dice tumble, the fiddler scrape, the women smile faintly, the patrons shout, and you wonder how long the mask can hold before silence returns, heavier than ever. The noise lingers in your ears long after the laughter fades, and you notice details you had overlooked before. The women moving through the room are not dressed in silks or jewels, as the lurid songs would have you believe. Instead, their clothing is practical, carefully regulated, and, most strikingly, uniform. Long gowns of dull cloth fall to their ankles, patched and repatched, dyed in shades that once might have been bright, but now resemble mud and ash. Each one wears a veil of some kind, pulled across hair or tied loosely at the shoulders, a mark as visible as a brand. Historians still argue whether these clothing laws were enforced as strictly as the statutes claim, but city records leave little doubt about the intent. Brothel workers were often required to wear garments of specific colors, sometimes yellow, sometimes striped, sometimes with bells sewn to hems, so that they could never be mistaken for respectable women in the streets. The idea was to draw boundaries, to keep temptation visible, yet segregated, tolerated, yet stigmatized. Standing here, you realize how effective the rules must have been. The women look less like individuals and more like uniforms of survival. One woman brushes past you, and the coarse fabric of her gown scratches your arm. The weave is rough, cheaper than the linen worn by the merchant's wife you passed earlier in the market. Her veil has slipped, revealing hair hastily pinned, but she tucks it back quickly, as though exposure might earn her a fine. A quirky tidbit flickers in your memory. In some towns, officials imposed penalties on women who appeared in public without the required veil, even if they were on their way to church. Imagine kneeling to pray, while the law required you to remain marked as untouchable. The mistress surveys her workers with a sharp eye, ensuring the rules are followed. When she spots a girl whose sleeves are rolled a little too high, she snaps her fingers. The girl flushes, tugging the fabric down. It is not modesty that matters here. It is regulation, visibility, the constant reminder that these women belong to a different class of citizen. You wonder whether the cloth feels heavier because of its weave or because of the stigma it carries. You take a seat near the hearth, watching the women circulate. One pours ale, her veil slipping to reveal a small embroidered patch at the corner of her gown. The stitches are uneven, clearly done by hand, perhaps late at night by candlelight. It strikes you that even within uniforms, individuality seeps through. She has chosen to mend with thread of a brighter color, defying dullness with quiet insistence. Historians still argue whether these uniforms were intended for punishment or for protection. Some suggest that distinctive clothing made women easier to identify, preventing false accusations against honest wives. Others argue it was a scarlet mark, branding women as perpetual outsiders. Here, in the dim hall, you sense it is both. The clothing shields them from confusion, but traps them in visibility, a paradox stitched into every seam. The fiddler strikes up a tune again, and one of the younger women claps along, her sleeves tugging back slightly. You notice bruises at her wrist, faint but visible. She pulls the fabric down quickly, eyes darting toward the mistress. The mark might have come from a careless patron, or perhaps from labor, or even from the rough handling of buckets and trays. Whatever the cause, she hides it with the same urgency she hides her hair, because marks of suffering are not permitted to show. The garment is her shield, her disguise, her prison. A man at a nearby table comments crudely on the dullness of the gowns, laughing that they make the women look like monks. His companions chuckle, though uneasily. The woman he speaks of forces a smile, though her eyes flash briefly with something colder. She cannot protest. The garment speaks for her, marking her silence as required. You think of how clothing in the medieval world carried meaning far beyond fabric. Colors signaled trade, guild, wealth, and status. To force women in brothels to wear specific colors was not only to separate them, but to redefine them as a class apart. It is the same logic that compelled lepers to carry clappers or Jews to wear badges. Visibility as a form of control. A quirky fact slips into your thoughts. In one Italian city, brothel workers were required to wear striped cloaks, the same pattern used for jesters. The implication was clear: mockery woven into the very fabric of their lives. You glance again at the patched gowns here, and wonder whether laughter outside the brothel was as cruel as the songs inside. The hall grows warmer, the air thick with smoke, and you notice how the women adjust their garments, tugging veils away from faces to breathe, fanning themselves with aprons when no one is watching. The rules may demand coverage, but the body resists, seeking air, seeking freedom. You realize the garments are not only social cages but physical ones, trapping heat, chafing skin, exhausting flesh. Historians still argue whether any women managed to escape these uniforms, slipping into anonymity. Records suggest fines were heavy for those caught, yet human ingenuity is strong. Perhaps some borrowed cloaks from friends, blending into market crowds for a stolen hour of freedom. The thought gives you a flicker of hope that even in systems of control, cracks appear, and through them, humanity slips. A woman passes carrying a tray, her gown swaying heavily with each step. She catches your eye for an instant, and you sense her weariness. Yet her veil is pinned neatly, her gown repaired carefully. Even within constraint, there is pride. Pride in maintaining what little dignity is permitted. You sip your ale, feeling the scratch of the fabric still lingering on your arm, and realize that the brothel's reality is stitched not only into walls and ledgers, but into every thread of those regulated garments. The fiddler's tune fades, replaced by the low murmur of conversation. The women continue their work, their gowns brushing against benches, their veils trailing faintly in the smoke. You lean back, observing how the uniforms blend them together. Yet individuality persists in gestures, in patches, in eyes that flicker briefly before lowering again. And you understand, with a heaviness that grows with each passing moment, that the brothel's women are bound not only by debts and rules, but by fabric itself. Clothing that was meant to shield has become a constant reminder that society has already judged them, long before they opened their mouths. The fire in the hearth crackles weakly, its glow more smoke than flame, and you sense a shift in the room. The earlier noise of dice and song settles into a lower hum, the kind that leaves gaps where silence seeps through. In those spaces, you notice tension. A man slams his mug harder than necessary, ale splashing across the table. Another grumbles about lost coin, his voice thick with resentment. The mistress glances up, her expression calm but sharp. She knows the signs well. Brothels, for all their regulation, were never free from danger. Violence lingered always, just under the surface. You feel it in the way men shift on benches, in how women move more quickly between tables, in the flicker of candlelight across knives strapped at belts. The illusion of merriment thins, revealing the truth. Any hall filled with tired men, weak ale, and fragile pride is only a moment away from chaos. Historians still argue whether city officials stationed guards near brothels to keep order or to collect bribes. Records show patrols in some towns, but also frequent brawls that spilled into the streets. Tonight, you see how easily sparks could catch. One wrong word, one lost coin, one glance held too long, and the room would tilt into disorder. A man at the dice table shouts suddenly, accusing his opponent of cheating. He slams the dice against the wood, demanding proof. His opponent, red-faced, shoves back. Benches scrape, mugs topple, and for a heartbeat the entire hall freezes. You watch the mistress rise, her steps measured, her gaze cutting through the smoke. She does not shout. Instead, she places her hand flat on the table, pressing the dice beneath her palm. Her calm is disarming. The men grumble, curse under their breath, but they sit. The tension does not vanish, but it ebbs, leaving behind only sullen muttering. You exhale, realizing how quickly laughter turns to danger here. The women continue their circuits, though you notice how their eyes dart toward the quarrel, alert for escalation. They have lived this before. They know that brawls can spiral, that knives flash faster than words. Their movements are careful now, trays balanced with steady hands, voices pitched low to soothe rather than excite. A quirky tidbit surfaces. Some medieval brothels employed bouncers, often former soldiers or hired strongmen, to break up fights. Chronicles mention men with cudgels standing in corners, silent until needed. Whether they were protectors or enforcers is unclear. You glance toward the doorway now and notice a man leaning against the frame, arms crossed, eyes half shut, but watchful. His presence alone may be enough to dissuade violence. For now. The fiddler resumes his tune, though softer this time, as though music itself could calm tempers. A few patrons clap along, forcing laughter, trying to drag the atmosphere back toward levity. Yet you can feel the edge still present, like a blade hidden in shadow. Another commotion stirs when a man reaches too roughly for a woman's arm. She jerks back, her smile fading instantly. For a second, silence falls. Then she laughs, brittle and sharp, shaking free and turning the moment into a joke. The patrons around her chuckle uneasily, grateful for the disguise. Yet you can see the stiffness in her shoulders, the tightness in her grip on the tray. It is a reminder that danger here is not only between men, but woven into every exchange. Historians still argue whether women in brothels had any true recourse against violent clients. Some city statutes promised protection, fining or banning patrons who caused harm. Others ignored the problem entirely, treating injuries as part of the trade. What the records rarely capture is the constant vigilance required, the way every woman's eyes flicker toward exits, the way every smile hides calculation, the way survival depends on reading danger before it ignites. The mistress circles the hall again, her keys clinking faintly at her belt. She stops beside the man who grabbed the woman's arm, leans close, and whispers something. His expression changes, first defiant, then sullen. He mutters, stands, and slouches toward the door. The mistress does not follow. She knows her authority stretches farther than fists. The man will not return soon, at least not without more coin in his pocket. You sip your ale, though it has gone flat, and watch the room steady itself once more. The dice clatter, the songs stumble on, but the undercurrent remains. This is not a safe place. It is a place of negotiation, of constant balance, of vigilance dressed as entertainment. The threat of violence is never gone. It simply shifts, waiting for the next spark. A quirky fact returns to you. Some brothel statutes banned weapons inside, requiring patrons to surrender knives at the door. Yet records also note how rarely this was enforced. Imagine a room full of men without their blades. The brawls might be less deadly, but pride would still demand fists. Tonight, you see knives at belts, daggers glinting in firelight. Their presence tolerated because disarming patrons would risk losing them altogether. Coin outweighs caution. Another cough echoes from upstairs, and for a moment the hall stills. You realize how fragile this piece is, how easily unease multiplies. Sickness, debt, jealousy, drink. Each is a spark, and the hall is dry tinder. The mistress holds it together with gaze and ledger, the women with smiles and quick feet, the fiddler with trembling strings. Yet the threat never vanishes. It only waits. Historians still argue whether medieval brothels were primarily spaces of chaos or of order. Some chroniclers describe dens of riot. Others speak of carefully managed establishments. Looking around, you suspect both were true. Order held until it snapped. Peace lasted only as long as fear outweighed fury. The balance was delicate, shifting nightly, measured in spilled ale and clenched fists. You watch a group of patrons slump deeper into their benches, voices softening as drink takes its toll. The fiddler's tune grows slower, more like a lullaby than a reel. For a moment, calm returns. Yet you know, from the glances exchanged and the tension in shoulders, that calm here is never more than an interlude. The mistress closes her ledger, snapping it shut with finality. She surveys the hall, satisfied for now, and signals for the serving girls to refill mugs. You realize that survival in this place is not about avoiding danger, but managing it. Keeping tempers just below boiling. Keeping patrons just drunk enough to laugh instead of fight. Keeping knives sheathed through a mixture of distraction and quiet threat. And as you lean back, watching shadows stretch across the hall, you wonder how anyone could truly rest in such a place, knowing that at any moment the fragile mask of entertainment might rip away, revealing the raw edge of danger beneath. The air in the hall has grown thick with more than smoke. Beneath the chatter and the scraping of dice, you begin to hear fragments of quieter conversations, murmurs that reveal another truth of this place. Debts. They hover in every corner like invisible chains, binding the women more securely than any lock. A serving girl pauses near your table, setting down a mug for a weary patron. Her smile wavers when she notices your gaze, and perhaps because you seem less threatening than others, she leans closer. Her voice is low, nearly drowned by the fiddler's tune, but you catch the words. Coin keeps us here more than doors. She straightens quickly, as though afraid the mistress might hear, and drifts away, leaving the thought lodged firmly in your mind. Historians still argue whether women in brothels were bound by choice or compulsion. Records speak of contracts, agreements signed with mistresses or civic officials that locked women into years of service. Some of these contracts included loans for clothing or shelter, debts that grew with interest until escape was nearly impossible. Others describe women who entered freely, but found themselves trapped by fines, fees, and the slow suffocation of expenses. The debate continues, but standing here, you sense that compulsion and choice blur until they are indistinguishable. You overhear a man at the next table complaining about his tab. "She'll never let me leave till it's paid," he mutters, though he speaks of the mistress rather than his wife at home. He laughs as though it is a joke, but the sound is brittle. His companions chuckle, then fall silent, perhaps reminded of their own ledgers waiting to be tallied. The women's debts take subtler forms. You watch one carrying a tray of mugs, her shoulders sagging. Another intercepts her, whispering urgently, "Did you pay for the comb yet?" The first shakes her head quickly, muttering that she owes too much already. A quirky tidbit surfaces. Brothel keepers often sold basic items like combs, ribbons, or even soap at inflated prices, adding the cost to a woman's account. These were luxuries nowhere else, but here they became necessities bought on credit. The mistress moves through the hall, her ledger tucked under her arm. She stops occasionally to speak with women, her tone calm but firm, and you notice the way they lower their eyes, nodding quickly. Each conversation is short, but each leaves the woman walking away more hurried, more tense. It is not just labor that binds them here. It is the numbers inked in that book. You think of the phrase house credit, which sounds almost generous until you realize its weight. A woman who fell behind on payments owed the mistress not only money, but hours, nights, and eventually years. Some records suggest women could work decades without clearing their accounts. The cycle self-sustaining and endless. The serving girl's words return to you. "Coin keeps us here more than doors." The fiddler tries another tune, but the mood is shifted. Patrons listen without enthusiasm, their attention wandering toward dice and debts alike. One man wagers more heavily than he can afford, slamming his last coins onto the table. He wins, laughs, buys another round. For now, his fortune has turned. Yet you know that luck rarely lasts, and debts collected in the morning bite harder than victories at night. Historians still argue whether brothel debts were enforceable by law. Some cities allowed women to sue or be sued over contracts, giving them theoretical rights. Others treated them as wards of the mistress, denying them autonomy altogether. The surviving documents are contradictory, leaving scholars to debate whether these women were closer to servants, to tenants, or to prisoners. Watching the mistress glide through the hall, ledger in hand, you see all three roles enforced at once. You glance at the stairs leading to the chambers above, imagining the women who climb them nightly. Each step is a tally, another coin owed, another debt increased. The straw beds upstairs are not only uncomfortable, they are reminders that every service rendered is already accounted for in ink, already calculated against a woman's future. Sleep is not relief. It is merely a pause in payment. A quirky anecdote drifts into your mind. In one city, women could be fined for leaving the brothel without permission, the penalty added to their accounts. Imagine walking to the market, longing for fresh bread or clean air, only to return and find yourself deeper in debt. Here, every choice narrows, every freedom shrinks, until only obedience remains affordable. You sip what remains of your ale, though the taste is stale, and you feel a heaviness settle in your chest. You came expecting revelry, but what you witness is a system of credit and control, dressed in candlelight. The jokes, the songs, the dice, all of them orbit around the mistress's ledger, each coin dropped into her pouch, tightening the web around workers and patrons alike. One woman passes by, her tray nearly empty. She pauses briefly to adjust her gown, and you hear her murmur, "2 more nights, and I can buy the shoes." The words sound almost hopeful, yet you realize they represent another purchase on credit, another line in the book. Hope itself has been monetized, sold in installments. The mistress sits again, her abacus clicking as she tallies. She scratches figures, closes the book, then opens it again minutes later. The cycle is endless. She does not raise her voice. She does not brandish a whip. Yet her power is absolute, enforced not by muscle, but by ink and coin. You realize that fear of debt is stronger than fear of fists. Historians still argue whether this system was exploitative beyond measure or simply reflective of broader medieval economies. Apprentices owed their masters, tenants owed their lords, peasants owed their rents. Debt bound society together like mortar. Yet here, in the dim light of a brothel, the weight feels sharper, more suffocating. For these women, debt is not only economic, it is personal, written on their bodies as much as in ledgers. The fiddler lowers his bow, silence creeping in. For a heartbeat, the hall is quiet, heavy with smoke and unspoken numbers. Then laughter rises again, brittle and forced. Dice clatter once more. Mugs slam against tables. The cycle resumes, disguising debt beneath noise. You sit back, watching shadows lengthen on the walls, and you realize that survival in this place is not about desire or indulgence. It is about accounts, coins counted, debts tallied, hours sold. And the thought presses on you, heavier than the smoke. No one here is free. Not patrons, not workers, not even the mistress herself. Bound always to the city that taxes her survival. The hour grows later, and with it, the mood shifts again. The noise that once masked unease begins to thin, replaced by conversations more reflective, more philosophical, though often still clumsy with drink. You hear the word hell tossed into the air, followed swiftly by necessary. A debate rises between 2 men, their voices weaving through the smoke. One condemning the place as a pit of vice, the other insisting it spares honest women from harassment. You lean closer, realizing you have stumbled into a contradiction that has occupied minds for centuries. Historians still argue whether medieval brothels were tolerated primarily to protect social order or to indulge civic hypocrisy. The paradox is plain. Sermons thundered against lust, yet city laws licensed houses like this one, justifying them as safety valves for society. You see the same paradox enacted in miniature at this table. The first man bangs his fist, declaring that every soul here is doomed. The second shrugs, pointing out that without such places, the streets would be worse. Their argument captures the very tension that defined the era. A woman passing with a tray pauses to listen. She smiles faintly, though her eyes are hard. Perhaps she has heard these arguments countless times, her existence debated as though she were an abstract concept rather than flesh and bone. She moves on, leaving the men to quarrel over her fate without her voice included. A quirky tidbit surfaces. In Paris, some theologians once described brothels as lesser evils, comparing them to sewers, necessary to contain filth lest it spread. The metaphor is cruel, yet it reveals the mindset of civic leaders. Control, not compassion, drove their policies. You glance around this hall and wonder whether any patron considers himself a beneficiary of such logic, or whether they prefer to forget the justifications that make their indulgence legal. Nearby, a young scholar in threadbare robes argues with surprising eloquence. He insists that houses like these corrupt the soul of the city, turning every coin into a sin shared by all. His companions laugh, mocking his seriousness, but he persists, quoting verses about purity. You note the irony. His very presence here undermines his claim, yet his words echo genuine belief. Perhaps he came not to indulge, but to witness, to test his conviction. Or perhaps he will slip upstairs later, proving himself as contradictory as the laws he denounces. Historians still argue whether moralists genuinely wished to abolish brothels, or merely to posture. Many councils debated closures, yet most reopened the houses quickly, unable to sacrifice the steady flow of taxes. Theologians wrote condemnations in ink, but magistrates wrote licenses in the same breath. Watching the scholar, you see that same duplicity flicker across his face. Conviction battling temptation, judgment battling need. The fiddler, sensing the heavier tone, softens his playing, letting the notes fade into background hum. A man across the hall begins telling a story about a preacher who stormed a brothel to cast out demons, only to be caught there weeks later himself. The crowd laughs, shaking their heads at the hypocrisy. The tale may be exaggerated, but its spirit rings true. Those who condemned loudest often strayed quickest. A woman seated near the hearth overhears and shakes her head. They talk of sin, she mutters, but take our coin all the same. Her voice is low, but you catch the bitterness. She means the priests, the officials, the same men who denounce by day, yet collect dues by night. Her words linger, sharper than any sermon. A quirky anecdote comes to mind. In some towns, civic leaders defended brothels by comparing them to fire breaks, barriers that contain danger. The metaphor is tidy, but when you look around this hall, it feels absurd. There is no containment here, only lives tangled in contradictions, morality bent into shapes that suit convenience. The men at the debating table grow louder. One insists the church condemns such places without exception. The other counters with tales of bishops who tolerated them, even protected them. The truth, as always, lies tangled. Some bishops railed, others collected taxes, others simply turned away. The contradiction was not hidden. It was lived, daily, by everyone involved. You sip from your mug, though the ale is now lukewarm. The taste lingers unpleasantly, and you set it aside. Your gaze drifts to the mistress, still at her ledger, her expression unchanged. To her, the debate is meaningless. Condemnation, justification, both end in the same place. Her paying taxes, her tallying debts, her keeping the house alive. She embodies the paradox better than any scholar could articulate. Historians still argue whether women like her believed in the morality of their work. Some chronicles describe them as cynical, others as resigned, others still as defiant. The record is inconclusive. Watching her, you sense that belief hardly matters. She is less philosopher than pragmatist, guided not by sermons, but by survival. The fiddler's bow slips, producing a squeal that makes the crowd chuckle. A man jokes that even the fiddle condemns them. Laughter ripples, easing the tension for a moment. Yet beneath it, the debate continues, murmured now, woven into the fabric of the night. Some condemn, some justify, all participate. The paradox is not solved. It is endured. A woman near your bench adjusts her veil, speaking quietly to another. They call us sin, she says, but they pay for their sins with our labor. The second nods, her expression unreadable. You realize that the debate about morality rarely includes the voices of those most affected. Their existence is reduced to metaphors, sewers, fire breaks, necessary evils, while they themselves carry the burden of survival. A quirky fact emerges. Some medieval scholars argued that brothels prevented greater crimes, claiming they kept men from pursuing violence or violating cloisters. Others rejected the argument entirely, warning that vice multiplies rather than diminishes. The contradiction is endless, a cycle of justification and rejection that never finds resolution. The church bells toll again, deeper this time, and the sound carries through the shutters. For a moment, the hall falls silent, every head turning slightly, as though reminded of judgment. Then the noise resumes, laughter and dice clattering louder, almost defiantly. You feel the paradox press on you, condemnation ringing in the air, indulgence humming in the hall. Both truths coexist, neither erasing the other. Historians still argue whether these contradictions will have weakened faith or strengthened it. Some suggest that tolerance of brothels revealed hypocrisy at the core of medieval religion. Others argue it demonstrated the Church's ability to manage human weakness pragmatically. The debate continues, unresolved. You sit in the midst of it now, watching contradictions walk and breathe, drink and laugh, tally and endure. The night deepens, the candlelight dims, and you sense that the paradox is not meant to be solved. It is meant to be lived, endured by those within and ignored by those outside. And as you lean back, the smoke curling above you, you realize that this, more than any scandalous tale, is the true history of the medieval brothel, a place balanced forever between condemnation and necessity, between sermons and ledgers, between judgment and survival. The bells outside fade into the night, their echoes swallowed by the thick walls. Within the hall, however, another voice rises. Not a song, not a quarrel, but the muttering of a man, dressed in clerical robes. His tonsure is uneven, his cloak patched, but the faint shimmer of a cross at his neck betrays his status. He sits near the fire, clutching a mug, his expression caught between shame and defiance. It takes only moments for whispers to ripple around the room. The presence of the church is never subtle, even when disguised in ale-stained linen. You recall how medieval sermons thundered against brothels, branding them as gateways to hell. Yet here sits a man of the cloth. His eyes are heavy, his hands trembling as he lifts the mug to his lips. He does not speak loudly, but the women notice him, and so does the mistress. She watches carefully, though she makes no move to expel him. Perhaps he has been here before. Perhaps his coin is familiar. Historians still argue whether priests frequented brothels out of hypocrisy, loneliness, or simple human weakness. Some records accuse entire chapters of clergy of indulging, despite their vows. Others insist such tales were exaggerations by critics seeking to shame the church. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Priests denounced with one hand while counting taxes with the other, condemning publicly but participating privately. The cleric mutters again, and this time you catch the words, "Forgive me." He stares into the fire, lips moving as though praying, though his other hand reaches to signal for more ale. The contradiction is painful to watch. A man who wears the symbols of faith while paying for the fruits of sin. Yet his presence is no anomaly. It reflects the broader entanglement between brothels and the church itself. A quirky tidbit surfaces. In some towns, a portion of brothel taxes was used specifically for church repairs. There are records of cathedrals funded in part by coins earned in places exactly like this. Imagine kneeling in prayer beneath a roof patched by the wages of desperation. The irony was not hidden. It was simply endured. A truth everyone knew, but few named aloud. The scholar you overheard earlier seizes the moment, pointing toward the cleric. "There," he declares to his companions. "Proof that the church is as corrupt as the rest." His voice carries, and several patrons laugh. Yet others shake their heads, unwilling to mock openly. The cleric stiffens, but does not respond. His silence is as telling as any argument. Historians still argue whether brothels were tolerated by priests out of pragmatic realism or cynical greed. Some moralists insisted such houses prevented greater sins, offering men an outlet away from cloisters or households. Others decried them as blasphemy, tolerated only for coin. Tonight, you see the contradiction embodied in a single man, hunched by the fire, caught between prayer and indulgence. The mistress, sensing tension, approaches the cleric. She leans close, her words inaudible, but her hand rests briefly on his shoulder. He nods, sighs, and lowers his gaze. Whether she reassures him or reminds him of his debt, you cannot tell. Yet the exchange shows another truth. Even priests were subject to the ledger. Faith does not erase obligation. You sip your ale, though its taste has not improved. The hall feels heavier now, its contradictions pressing on you from every side. The dice rattle again, laughter resumes, but your attention lingers on the cleric's bowed head. He is one man, yet he represents the larger paradox that defines this place. The church that condemns yet profits, that preaches purity yet tolerates impurity, that builds altars with coins taken from ledgers like the one resting in the mistress's lap. A woman near your bench mutters bitterly to her companion, "They take our taxes by day and our beds by night." Her voice is low, but her anger is real. She has no patience for scholarly debate or theological nuance. To her, the contradiction is not intellectual, but practical, carved into her body and her coin. A quirky anecdote drifts into your thoughts. One medieval bishop, upon discovering that a portion of church revenue came from brothel taxes, declared it better to build holy walls with sinful coin than to leave them crumbling. The statement reveals the pragmatic bend of the time, a willingness to reconcile contradiction through sheer necessity. Yet you wonder how many women, like the one beside you now, chafed at being both condemned and exploited. The fiddler shifts his tune again, louder this time, as though to drown the debate. Patrons cheer, mugs slam, dice roll. The noise rises, covering the cleric's silence. Yet the contradiction remains, woven into every sound, every exchange. You glance again at the mistress, who writes calmly in her ledger. To her, the presence of the church is neither scandal nor salvation. It is simply another customer, another coin, another line on a page. Historians still argue whether this hypocrisy weakened the authority of the church or strengthened its grip by acknowledging human weakness. Some suggest that by tolerating brothels, the church admitted the inevitability of sin, managing it rather than denying it. Others argue that the hypocrisy corroded faith from within, planting seeds of cynicism that would later bloom in reform. Watching the cleric, you sense both possibilities. His prayer and his ale, his cross and his coin. They are the same paradox writ small. The bells toll again outside, softer now, their sound muffled by distance. Inside, the hall roars louder, laughter defiantly mocking judgment. Yet beneath the noise, you hear whispers, murmurs of resentment, fragments of prayer. This house survives not despite contradiction, but because of it, thriving in the space between condemnation and profit. You lean back, your eyes heavy, and wonder how many other halls across Europe echoed with the same paradox. How many cathedrals rose with coins scraped from nights like this? How many sermons thundered louder precisely because the preacher's conscience weighed heavier? How many ledgers balanced faith and sin in the same column? And you realize that this is thought, the brothel's truest legacy. Not scandal or romance, but contradiction. A place where the church's voice condemns, its purse collects, and its followers kneel at altars, repaired by the very wages they damned. The night stretches onward, its hours marked not by clocks, but by the ebb and flow of voices in the hall. You feel weariness creep into your limbs, but the brothel does not sleep. Its rhythm is constant, relentless, designed to keep coin and bodies moving until the sun itself forces a pause. The hall grows dimmer as candles sputter lower, the air thicker with smoke and breath. And yet the noise refuses to quiet. For every patron who slumps forward onto a bench, another stirs restlessly, demanding another mug, another throw of dice, another moment of distraction. You return to the chamber upstairs, hoping for rest, but the straw mattress greets you with the same prickling discomfort as before. The linen scratches, the damp air chills, and the noise from below seeps easily through thin boards. Sleep is a distant hope. You lie still, listening, and realize how much of the brothel is designed not for rest, but for endurance. The footsteps in the corridor never cease. Workers climb and descend the stairs, doors creak, voices murmur. Sometimes laughter, sometimes sharp words, sometimes silence heavier than either. You shift on the straw, each movement answered by rustling that sounds far too loud in the dark. The candle at your bedside has burned down to a stub, wax pooling unevenly, casting shadows that flicker with unnerving life. Historians still argue whether patrons truly stayed through the night in brothels, or whether most came only for hours at a time. Records reveal contracts for rooms, sometimes for whole evenings, but also frequent complaints of noise and disorder disturbing neighbors. What seems certain is that these places were not havens of sleep. They were houses of interruption, where rest was stolen if at all, always broken by footsteps, arguments, or the sudden an eruption of laughter. You turn again, but the bed groans as though scolding you for expecting comfort. Your back aches from the uneven stuffing, and you envy the apprentices downstairs, who at least slump against benches in drunken oblivion. Here in the chamber you have only awareness of sound, of smell, of unease. A quirky tidbit comes to mind. In some accounts, brothel beds were filled not with fresh straw, but with bundles of reeds or even moss, materials cheaper, but far more uncomfortable. The prickling at your side convinces you that this bed may belong to that category. From the hall below, a sudden shout rises, followed by the sharp clatter of wood on wood. You hold your breath, waiting for escalation, but the sound dwindles into laughter. Dice again, or perhaps a quarrel smoothed over by more ale. Still, the reminder unsettles you. Safety here is fragile, always one spark away from flames. You close your eyes, yet the darkness behind them is no gentler. The air feels thick, pressing against your chest, carrying scents that refuse to fade. Ale soured in mugs, smoke lingering in cloth, sweat clinging to timber. Even if silence arrived, the smell alone would keep you awake. You breathe shallowly, trying to trick your body into calm. The church bells toll again outside, faint but audible, Their rhythm marks time in ways the brothel cannot deny. You imagine townsfolk sleeping in their homes, wrapped in clean linen, while here, you lie restless in straw. The irony gnaws at you. Brothels were tolerated to keep order in the city, yet within their walls, order collapses into sleepless chaos. Historians still argue whether municipal leaders truly believed brothels maintained public peace, or whether they simply valued the tax revenue. Reading the accounts, you see both claims repeated, often by the same councils. Tonight, lying in a chamber that refuses to offer peace, you suspect the truth leaned heavily toward revenue. Peace is scarce here, and order exists only so far as ledgers demand it. The footsteps in the corridor grow louder, then fade. A door slams. A muffled cry follows, quickly silenced. You stare at the ceiling, heart quickened, realizing that violence does not always break out in the hall, where all can see. Sometimes it hides behind thin plaster, where only the unlucky hear. You shift again, the straw rustling angrily, and press your cloak tighter. The candle finally gutters out, leaving you in near darkness. Only the faint glow from cracks in the shutters remains, silver threads weaving across the floor. You try to count your breaths, to steady your mind, but each creak of timber distracts you. You realize now why so many patrons drink themselves into oblivion. It is the only escape from wakefulness in such a place. A quirky anecdote surfaces. Some towns required brothels to close at dawn on holy days, forcing patrons into the streets whether they had slept or not. Imagine stumbling into morning service at the cathedral, eyes bleary, body aching, guilt gnawing at your ribs. Perhaps that too was a kind of regulation, not to protect virtue, but to display vice, sending men into daylight with the marks of indulgence plain to see. You roll again, trying to find comfort in the straw, but the uneven lumps press harder. Sleep refuses. Your thoughts wander instead, replaying the faces of the women, the tallying of the mistress, the contradictions of the cleric. The room becomes a chamber of memory rather than rest, each sound pulling another image into your mind. Historians still argue whether brothels were tolerated as necessary evils, or whether they reflected deeper acceptance of human weakness. The debate continues, but lying awake here, you see neither necessity nor acceptance. You see fatigue, discomfort, unease, conditions that crush joy rather than sustain it. This is not indulgence. It is endurance disguised as revelry. Hours creep by, marked by the fading of voices below. At last, the hall grows quieter, though not silent. A final mug slams, a final laugh echoes, and then the sound of benches scraping across the floor. You hear the fiddler cough, mutter, and stumble toward the door. The quiet that follows is uneasy, filled with the breathing of sleepers and the restless rustle of straw. You close your eyes again, forcing your mind to slow. The bed still pricks, the air still stinks, the shutters still rattle. Yet exhaustion claims you at last, dragging you into a shallow, broken sleep. Dreams flicker quickly, filled with echoes of dice, of ledgers, of veils brushing past your arm. You wake often, uncertain whether minutes or hours have passed. And when at last the first light of dawn pushes through the shutters, you feel no relief. Your body aches, your eyes burn, and you realize you are more weary than when you first lay down. Sleep in this place does not restore. It drains, leaving you emptier than before. The hall below stirs again, footsteps rising, voices muttering. The cycle resumes without pause. You sit up, rubbing your eyes, the straw clinging to your cloak. The morning has arrived, though the night has not truly ended. For those who live here, nights and days blur, each one identical. Each one marked not by rest, but by survival. And as you rise from the bed, shoulders stiff, you understand at last why a single night in a medieval brothel could feel like a lifetime. Too noisy to sleep, too smoky to breathe, too dangerous to rest, too exhausting to repeat. The shutters rattle faintly as dawn creeps across the horizon. You step carefully down the narrow stairs, cloak drawn around your shoulders, body aching from a night without rest. The hall looks different in morning light. Benches pushed askew, mugs tipped on their sides, puddles of ale dried into sticky patches. The air carries a staleness sharper than smoke, a mixture of sweat, ash, and spilled stew that no candle can disguise. Patrons who remain slouch heavily, heads bowed, hands slack against tables. Some mutter in their sleep, others blink groggily, startled by the sun invading what was meant to be a place of concealment. The mistress sits where she always has, her ledger open, her quill poised. She counts coins with the same calm she showed hours earlier, tallying debts, marking names, ensuring nothing is lost between night and day. Her face betrays neither fatigue nor triumph. She is as relentless as her abacus, her entire being aligned with calculation. You realize that for her, dawn is not release, but merely continuation. The night does not end. It folds into the day, the cycle endless. One by one, women drift through the hall. Their veils are askew, gowns creased, steps heavy. They carry trays of bowls and mugs, sweeping crumbs into piles, wiping tables, setting the room back into order. They do not look at patrons lingering over last mugs of ale. Their movements are quiet, practiced, mechanical. Survival demands repetition, and repetition offers no pause. You imagine they will climb to their straw bed soon, perhaps snatching an hour of sleep before duties begin again. Yet true rest will never come, not here. Historians still argue whether women in licensed brothels manage to find lives beyond these walls, whether they ever married, joined convents, or built new trades. Some evidence suggests a few escaped debt, purchased freedom, or inherited enough to move on. Others reveal cycles where women's names vanish from ledgers only to appear again years later, returned by poverty. The debate remains unresolved, as most voices left no record. Watching them now, you feel the weight of silence more than any document. A patron stirs, rubbing his eyes, fumbling with his cloak. He mutters about coin lost in dice, about debts waiting at home, about a wife who will notice his absence. He stumbles toward the door, boots dragging. The mistress glances up, notes his departure, scratches something into her book. Even leaving is recorded, tallied, weighed. You sense that the brothel remembers everyone, long after they forget themselves. The fiddler lies asleep on a bench, bow still in hand. His snores punctuate the silence, oddly comforting. Yet even he will wake soon, tune his strings, and play again. His role, like the others, repeats without change. Music is not meant for joy here. It is part of the machinery. Another cog in the endless cycle of distraction and endurance. A quirky detail returns to mind. Some brothel statutes required workers to rise early and present themselves for inspection by city officials, ensuring rules were followed. Imagine finishing a night like this, only to stand before a clerk at dawn, veil in place, face inspected like merchandise. Whether true for this house or not, the thought reveals how thin the boundary was between civic order and human exhaustion. The church bells toll once more, their sound bright and clean against the stale air inside. For a fleeting moment, light spills across the hall, illuminating every scar on the tables, every stain on the floor, every crease in a woman's gown. The contrast is jarring, sunlight declaring openly what night pretended to hide. You see clearly now that a medieval brothel was never the paradise of song or romance described in bawdy tales. It was weary labor, smoke and noise, ledgers and debts, discomfort and survival. You pause at the doorway, hand on the rough timber frame. The street outside is damp with dew, cobblestones gleaming under the new sun. A dog trots past, tail wagging, and in the distance, a baker's bell rings, calling customers for fresh bread. The ordinary life of the city has resumed, untroubled by the night within these walls. People will pass by, glancing at the faded emblem above the door, muttering condemnations, yet benefiting quietly from the taxes within. You step out into the morning, your cloak catching the cool air, your body heavy with fatigue. You have lasted one night, though barely, and you feel the truth of it. Even a single night in such a place leaves you more drained than when you entered. For those who live here, there is no leaving, no morning relief, only another cycle of noise, smoke, debt, and survival. And you walk away, carrying not indulgence, but insight. Legends of lust collapse into reality, and the reality is exhaustion. This is why you would not last a night in a medieval brothel. And now, as the streets grow quiet in your mind, let the weight of this night dissolve gently. The rough timber, the smoke-stained rafters, the endless clatter of dice and mugs, they all soften, fading into background whispers. The prickling straw that would not let you rest, the laughter too brittle to carry joy, the weary faces marked by veils and ledgers, all of it recedes, like mist drawn away by morning light. You no longer need to carry their burdens, their debts, their sleepless hours. Breathe slowly, letting your chest rise and fall as evenly as a tide. Imagine the hall empty now, benches stacked, candles snuffed, the ledger closed for a moment of stillness. The mistress sets down her quill. The fiddler lowers his bow. The women fold their gowns neatly, and silence spreads like a soft blanket across the room. Even the church bells pause, holding back their stern reminder, as if the city itself allows you this quiet space. The cobblestones outside glisten gently, washed clean by dew. The air is cool, no longer thick with smoke, carrying instead the faint scent of bread baking in some distant oven. Picture yourself walking slowly down that empty street, each step lighter than the one before, your cloak no longer heavy, your shoulders no longer tense. You have left the brothel behind, its fatigue and contradictions no longer binding you. And as you drift deeper into rest, let the images grow softer still. The noise fades into silence, the weight lifts from your chest, and the dawn light warms your eyelids. You are safe, you are calm, you are free to let go. Sleep settles now, steady and deep, carrying you far from ledgers and debts into dreams that hold only peace.